It was the evening of November 23rd, 1944, and the men of the Royal Air Force Anti-Aircraft Unit stationed at their base in Belgium were settling into what they expected to be another routine night of watchful waiting. The war had been raging for years, and while the Allied forces were making steady progress across Europe, the threat of German air raids remained ever present. The anti-aircraft crews maintained their vigilant posts, scanning the darkening skies for any sign of enemy activity. The evening was remarkably calm, with only a gentle breeze disturbing the autumn air. The gun crews chatted quietly among themselves, some sharing cigarettes, while others cleaned and maintained their equipment. It was the kind of peaceful evening that had become increasingly rare in wartime Europe, and the men were grateful for the respite from the usual tension that accompanied their duties. Then, without any warning, the impossible happened. Out of the gathering dusk, seemingly materializing from thin air, a massive Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress appeared on the horizon. The four-engine bomber, weighing in at over 65,000 pounds when fully loaded, was heading directly toward the anti-aircraft position. The men, at first, assumed it must be returning from a mission, perhaps damaged, and seeking the nearest Allied airfield. But something was terribly wrong with this picture. The B-17 was flying at an unusually high speed for an approach, and its trajectory was erratic, almost desperate. As it drew closer, the anti-aircraft crews could see that the bomber was indeed heavily damaged. Portions of the fuselage showed signs of combat, and the aircraft's flight pattern suggested that whoever was at the controls was fighting desperately to keep the massive plane airborne. "Hold your fire!" shouted Major John Crisp, the commanding officer of the anti-aircraft unit. He had quickly identified the approaching aircraft as American, recognizing the distinctive silhouette of the Flying Fortress against the darkening sky. "It's one of ours!" The men watched in mounting tension as the B-17 continued its approach. This was clearly an unscheduled landing attempt, and emergency procedures immediately went into effect. Crew members scrambled to clear the area, anticipating a possible crash landing. Flares were lit to help guide the damaged bomber toward the safest possible landing area, a relatively flat field adjacent to the anti-aircraft position. What followed was nothing short of miraculous. Despite its apparent damage and the failing light, the B-17 executed what could only be described as a textbook emergency landing. The massive bomber touched down in the field with surprising grace, though the impact was still violent enough to snap off several of the propellers, which went spinning through the air like deadly projectiles. Most remarkably, even after the rough landing, the engines continued to run, their steady drone filling the evening air. The Royal Air Force personnel, along with several civilian witnesses who had gathered to watch the spectacle, held their collective breath. They waited for the crew to emerge from the aircraft, expecting to see wounded airmen stumbling from the fuselage, grateful to have survived their ordeal. They waited for 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. Nothing happened. No movement from within the aircraft. No signs of life whatsoever. 20 minutes had now passed since the landing, and Major Crisp could wait no longer. The engines were still running, wasting precious fuel, and if there were wounded men aboard, they needed immediate medical attention. He assembled a small team of his most trusted men and gave them careful instructions. "Approach with extreme caution," he ordered. "We don't know what condition the crew might be in. They could be injured, unconscious, or in shock. Be prepared for anything. The team moved slowly across the field toward the B-17, which sat like a wounded bird of prey in the gathering darkness. The bomber was a B-17G model, the most advanced version of the Flying Fortress, equipped with a chin turret and additional defensive armaments. As they drew closer, they could see more clearly the extent of the damage. There were holes in the fuselage that looked like flak damage, and one of the engines showed signs of having been hit. Major Crisp himself led the boarding party. As a British officer, he wasn't immediately familiar with the American aircraft's entry points, but after a few moments of searching, he located an open hatch. His heart was pounding as he prepared to enter. What would he find inside? Wounded men? Bodies? Some explanation for this mysterious arrival? Taking a deep breath, Crisp pulled himself up into the aircraft. What he discovered inside defied all logic and expectation. The bomber was completely empty. Not a single soul was aboard. This was impossible. A B-17 Flying Fortress required a crew of 10 men to operate effectively: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners. Yet the aircraft was deserted. Even more puzzling, Crisp found nearly a dozen parachutes neatly wrapped and stowed in their proper positions, ready for use. If the crew had bailed out, why hadn't they taken their parachutes? As Crisp moved through the aircraft, examining each station, the mystery only deepened. In the nose section, he found the Norden bomb sight still wrapped in its protective covering, though the plexiglass nose cone itself was missing. At the navigator station, he discovered something particularly intriguing: a code book containing communication codes and identification colors. Someone had written "bad luck" in the margin of one page, though whether this was a crew notation or something more ominous was impossible to determine. The investigation revealed more puzzling details. Thick, fur-lined flight jackets lay scattered on the fuselage floor, along with boots and partially eaten chocolate bars. These were clear signs of recent human presence. At high altitude, B-17 crews needed these heavy jackets to survive the freezing temperatures, often well below zero. The fact that they were left behind suggested the crew had departed at a lower, warmer altitude. Crisp made his way to the cockpit, where he found the controls set and the autopilot engaged. He carefully shut down the 3 still-running engines, noting that aside from the landing damage and what appeared to be combat damage, the aircraft was in remarkably good condition. Everything was in its proper place, as if the crew had simply vanished into thin air. The mysterious B-17G had no nose art or name painted on its fuselage, which was unusual. Bomber crews typically took great pride in naming their aircraft and decorating them with elaborate paintings. In the absence of an official name, the personnel at the base began referring to the aircraft as the Phantom Fortress. The investigation intensified the following day. Military investigators descended upon the scene, meticulously examining every inch of the aircraft for clues. They eventually located the serial number, which identified the bomber as belonging to the 91st Bombardment Group, based in East Anglia, England. This was one of the most decorated bomber units in the 8th Air Force, known for their dangerous daylight bombing raids over Nazi-occupied Europe. Communications with the 91st Bombardment Group yielded astonishing news. Not only was the crew alive and well, but they had all been recovered safely at another air base in Belgium. The story they told was both remarkable and puzzling. The aircraft's pilot, Lieutenant Harold Debolt, was an experienced airman with dozens of missions under his belt. On the day in question, his crew had been assigned to bomb an oil refinery in Merseburg, Germany, one of the most heavily defended targets in the Third Reich. The mission had gone according to plan until they began their bombing run. Flying at a relatively low altitude to ensure bombing accuracy, the B-17 had attracted intense anti-aircraft fire from German flak batteries. The plane was hit multiple times, with shrapnel tearing through the bomb bay and knocking out one engine. By some miracle, none of the bombs in the bay had detonated, but the damage was severe. The weather, which had been marginal at takeoff, had deteriorated significantly. Violent turbulence shook the aircraft, and with one engine out and the plane carrying significant damage, Lieutenant Debolt found himself fighting a losing battle against gravity. He pushed the remaining engines to full power, but the heavily laden bomber continued to lose altitude at an alarming rate. In desperation, Debolt ordered his crew to jettison everything they could to lighten the aircraft: machine guns, ammunition, equipment. Anything not essential to flight was thrown overboard. But it wasn't enough. A second engine began to overheat from the strain and failed. With only two engines remaining and altitude dropping rapidly, Debolt made the difficult decision to abandon the aircraft. He turned the bomber toward Brussels, hoping to give his crew the best chance of landing in Allied-controlled territory. As the aircraft descended through 2,000 feet, he ordered everyone to prepare to bail out. One by one, the crew members exited the aircraft through various hatches. Debolt, as pilot and aircraft commander, would be the last to leave. Before departing, he performed one final act, engaging the Sperry S-1 autopilot. By modern standards, this was an extremely primitive system, capable only of maintaining level flight under ideal conditions. It couldn't execute turns, altitude changes, or certainly landings. Debolt assumed that with two engines out and the aircraft damaged, the B-17 would continue flying for perhaps a few minutes before crashing into the Belgian countryside. The crew's story should have ended there, with the empty bomber crashing harmlessly into a field. But instead, something extraordinary occurred. The B-17G not only remained airborne, but flew on for miles, eventually executing a perfect landing at an Allied airfield, all without a single person aboard. How was this possible? Investigators struggled to reconcile the crew's account with the physical evidence. When the Phantom Fortress landed, ground crews observed that all four engines were operating. The landing gear was properly deployed. Aside from the damage sustained during landing, the aircraft showed no signs of the extensive battle damage the crew had described. The mystery deepened when investigators examined the crew's story more carefully. All 10 men had survived their bailout without using parachutes. They claimed to have jumped at low altitude into trees and soft ground. While not impossible, the odds of an entire crew surviving such an exit without serious injury strained credibility. Various theories were proposed to explain the seemingly impossible events. The most rational explanation involved a series of highly unlikely but not impossible coincidences. Perhaps the two failed engines had simply overheated and shut down temporarily. The Wright Cyclone engines used in the B-17 were known for their reliability and had been documented to restart after cooling down. With the crew gone, the aircraft would have been significantly lighter, approximately 1,600 pounds lighter, just from the weight of 10 men plus all their equipment. This reduced weight, combined with the engine's cooling and restarting, might have allowed the aircraft to maintain altitude. The autopilot, while primitive, could have kept the aircraft in relatively stable flight. But this still didn't explain the landing. Who had lowered the landing gear? How had the aircraft happened to approach an airfield at exactly the right angle and speed for landing? The odds against such a perfect storm of coincidences were astronomical. Some suggested more exotic explanations. Could atmospheric conditions have created some sort of auto-rotation effect that naturally guided the plane to Earth? Had the crew actually stayed with the aircraft longer than they claimed, perhaps setting it up for landing before bailing out at the last moment? Was there an 11th unnamed crew member who had stayed behind? The military investigation ultimately concluded without providing definitive answers. The official report noted the facts as they were known. The aircraft had been abandoned by its crew over Belgium, had continued flying unmanned, and had executed a successful landing without human intervention. How this had occurred remained unexplained. The Phantom Fortress was eventually repaired and returned to service, though many crews considered it unlucky and preferred not to fly it. The aircraft completed several more missions before being lost over Germany in early 1945, taking its secrets with it. To this day, the incident remains one of the most puzzling mysteries of World War II. Veterans of the 91st Bombardment Group still gather to discuss the story, each offering their own theories about what really happened that November evening. Some accept the coincidence theory, while others maintain that there must be more to the story, some detail overlooked or deliberately omitted from the official record. Whatever the truth, the tale of the Phantom Fortress serves as a reminder that even in the most documented war in human history, there remain mysteries that defy easy explanation. It stands as a testament to the strange and inexplicable events that can occur when human beings push the boundaries of technology and endurance in the crucible of war. The story has become legend among aviation enthusiasts and paranormal researchers alike. Some see it as evidence of supernatural intervention, others as proof that the B-17 Flying Fortress was an aircraft so well designed that it could literally fly itself. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in that strange realm where engineering excellence meets the inexplicable forces that sometimes seem to guide human destiny. As Major John Crisp would reflect years later, standing in that empty bomber on that November evening in 1944, was one of the most unsettling experiences of his life. The evidence of recent human presence, the still warm engines, the perfectly set controls, all spoke of a crew that had simply vanished. The fact that they were later found safe gave the story a happy ending, but it did nothing to explain the central mystery. How does an unmanned, damaged bomber fly itself to a perfect landing? It remains, as Crisp himself described it, the most extraordinary thing I witnessed during the entire war. The Phantom Fortress had earned its name, taking its place among the great mysteries of aviation history, A ghost story with a twist, where the ghost was not the crew, but the empty plane itself, somehow finding its way home against all odds and reason.